Welcome, new friend. Tonight we're drifting back to the 1960s, when glowing tubes warmed living rooms and families leaned in together to share the same flickering story. Take a slow breath, settle in, and before we begin, tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? Now let's turn the dial to a gentler time. The living room felt like a gentle planet with its own weather. By early evening, a hush settled over the carpet, that soft hush of shoes kicked off by the door and sweaters folded over chair backs. A lamp in the corner glowed through a pleated shade, the light buttery and calm, and all the furniture leaned ever so slightly toward the television. An elegant box with a window that made the world smaller and somehow kinder. The air held a faint mix of lemon polish, warm dust, and the subtle metallic scent that rose when the tubes inside the set woke up and stretched. Someone always arrived first to claim the best seat, maybe a parent easing into a well-earned groove in the sofa cushion, maybe a kid sliding onto the floor and pulling a throw pillow under their chest. The cushions kept the day's memory, giving back a slow spring as people settled. A coffee table floated between the family and the screen, sturdy and dignified, scattered with coasters, a ceramic ashtray, a bowl of hard candies that tapped against the glass when shaken. There might be a basket of magazines within reach, their covers promising a shinier, tidier version of life. But when the TV warmed, even the magazines seemed to turn and listen. The television didn't snap to life so much as bloom. First the click of the knob, felt more than heard, and then a soft electric thrum. The screen brightened from a deep graphite to pearl, a grey fog that gathered itself and became a picture. Lines steadied, contrast found its balance, and the family leaned forward almost imperceptibly. In that quiet second, you could sense the room aligning. People straightening their posture, sliding closer, matching their breathing to the tempo of the scene. It wasn't just entertainment. It was a nightly reunion with the world beyond the walls. The living room understood fairness. Big kids took the floor because they could handle it. Smaller ones got carved-out corners of the sofa where a blanket lived in winter and a cool cotton sheet in summer. A dog might thump its tail twice and sigh, choosing a spot between two pairs of feet. A cat claimed the armrest, eyes half closed, perfectly indifferent to the plot but loyal to the ritual. A parent might shimmy a little to make space for a latecomer, the sort of small kindness that belongs to families and doesn't need to be announced. Sound gathered in a pleasant hush. The volume found its place, loud enough to hear, soft enough to let murmurs pass between commercial breaks. Laughter arrived in layers, the laughter on the show, then the laughter in the room, then the echo of it as the kids tried out the line under their breath to see if it felt like theirs yet. The living room could hold both, television laughter and real laughter, like a choir finding harmony on the first try. A parent often controlled the dial, fingers deft from practice, turning past snowstorms and ghost images to land on the channel that felt like home. If the picture ghosted, a child might be sent to adjust the rabbit ears, an honour disguised as chore. Hold it! Okay, now back just a smidge. Everybody learned the language of the signal. The tilt of an antenna as subtle as a nod. The way your own body became part of the circuitry when your hand hovered near the set. And the moment it clicked into clarity, the tiny miracle of faces sharpening, letters spelling themselves perfectly, felt like winning a prize the whole family could share. Even in black and white, the room filled with colour you could feel. Shadows were velvet, highlights had a clean sparkle, and the gradient between them became a mood you could lean into. The living room smell shifted with the seasons. Wool and wet mittens in winter, screen doors and a cool breeze in spring, the faint breath of freshly cut grass in summer, cinnamon and waxed floors in autumn. The TV absorbed it all and returned it as story, as if the room and the programme were trading gifts. Time slowed here. Minutes were not counted, but inhabited. The show provided a rhythm, setup, laugh, musical flourish, cutaway, soft dissolve that smoothed the roughness of the day. A child lulled by the steady glow might trace the pattern in the rug with one finger, finish a slow circle, and feel inexplicably complete. A parent's hand might find a shoulder absent-mindedly, a wordless anchor that said, "You're here, I'm here, we made it to this moment." On some nights, the television became a hearth against the wider world's cold. The news might carry images that felt heavy, and the living room gathered around them too, not to turn away, but to hold them together so no one bore them alone. On other nights, the set became a music hall where crooners turned breath into velvet, and orchestras stitched a glittering backdrop behind the sofa. There were nights of gentle mischief and nights of perfect predictability, both equally welcome. The living room liked variety the way a garden likes rain. Anything that arrives and brings people closer earns its place. Little rituals scattered through the hour like breadcrumbs. Someone always checked that the coasters were straight. Someone always insisted the curtains be pulled to cut the street's reflection. Someone always remembered the exact timing to dash for the kitchen and return with a plate of cookies before the opening theme ended. The plate warmed the hands, and the show warmed the room, and together they made an easy kind of contentment that felt almost like a secret. Even the commercials belonged to the living room. Jingles drifted into the fabric of the evening and stuck there. Kids parroted them in half whispers. Parents smiled and rolled their eyes, then joined in on the last line. Every few minutes, the house reclaimed a little space for itself. Someone coughed, someone stood and stretched. The ice in a glass ticked quietly as it settled. Then the story returned, and the room leaned forward again, like a tide responding to the moon. When the set finally dimmed, the room didn't lose its glow, it simply kept it more quietly. The screen's lingering dot faded to nothing, and conversation resurfaced without effort. People spoke softer than they had before, as if the warmth should be preserved. A child rubbed their eyes and tried to hold on to one last image. A parent made a gentle promise. There's more tomorrow, which somehow meant more than just another episode. The living room released everyone slowly, one by one, like a host who walks you all the way to the door so the goodbye doesn't feel abrupt. Later, when the house was still and the lucky ones were already dreaming, the living room remembered the shapes that had filled it. Curled knees, tucked feet, shoulders touching. It remembered the hum in the walls and the patterned light that wove across the rug. It remembered the small pauses that let everybody catch up with themselves. And when morning came, it would look to anyone passing through like a regular room, the sofa, the table, the lamp standing exactly where they always had. But by evening, when the knob clicked and the screen grew from graphite to pearl, the planet would bloom again, with gravity gentle enough to keep a family in orbit. It began with the softest ceremony, a hand on the knob, a pause, and then the click that set the evening in motion. The picture arrived generously but not perfectly, and that was the invitation. A little snow, a gentle ghost of a second image drifting to the side, a whisper of static like wind in tall grass. Someone would rise from the sofa without being asked. They knew this part by heart. The rabbit ears waited like a small silver wishbone, upright and hopeful. The first touch was always careful, as if the metal remembered. A slow angle outward, then inward. One antenna lifted higher, the other lowered like a polite bow. A voice from the couch, steady, authoritative, offered the choreography. "Hold it. A little more. Now stay right there." The picture obliged in increments, clearing its throat between shadows. You didn't conquer a signal, you coaxed it. There was an art to the stance. Knees slightly bent, one foot back for balance, body turned just off-center so you didn't block the screen. Some people swore that if you held your breath during the final adjustment, the picture would lock, as if the set could sense the steady heartbeat. Others claim that resting a finger lightly on the antenna made you part of the circuit and somehow a better citizen of television. You could feel the faint tingle of closeness. Nothing sharp, just the awareness that your body was now a quiet bridge between the air and the story waiting to come through it. The living room kept a roll of aluminum foil for special occasions. Not the kitchen foil, the living room foil, a skinny, wrinkled veteran that had seen many winters and sitcoms. Strips were torn and twisted into little banners, flags that supposedly pulled the channel closer. "It's science," someone would say with a grin that said it was also superstition. The foil made a whispery sound as it hugged the antenna, and everybody watched to see if snow softened into picture. Sometimes it did, which made it truer than any science had a right to be. The set had dials that felt like a safes combination. The big channel selector clicked through numbers with dignified weight, 2 to 13 for VHF, each stop a promise. Around it, like a halo, a smaller ring waited for fine-tuning, the delicate secret that separated a shape from a face from an expression. On the newer sets, there was a separate UHF dial, thin, high-numbered, more mysterious, where local stations lived like shy neighbours. Turning that one was like tuning a violin by ear in the dark, slow, careful, hopeful. The picture could be perfect for a breath and then drift. The fine-tuned ring asked for patience and rewarded it with eyelash-level clarity if you treated it kindly. Then there were the other guardians of the signal, vertical hold and horizontal hold. Their names sounded like virtues, and in a way they were. Vertical hold calmed the rolling screen that tumbled end over end like laundry. Horizontal hold disciplined a picture that slid sideways with quiet defiance. A gentle twist, a careful nudge, and the world stood upright again. Children learned the difference not from manuals but from the room's collective memory. "That one," a parent would murmur, and a child's hand would find the right knob with the confidence of a small sailor trimming a sail. Weather added its own notes. On dry winter nights, you might feel a crackle when your sleeve brushed the cabinet, and the picture would flare and settle as if clearing its throat. On stormy evenings, the signal wore a soft wool sweater of static. You could taste the approaching rain in the air, and the rabbit ears seemed to feel it too, growing sensitive and dramatic. Lightning on the horizon became a white blink on the screen, and conversations turned to the roof antenna 2 houses down, the way it cut the sky like a note on sheet music. "We should get one," someone would say every year. And every year the rabbit ears, faithful, portable, endlessly adjustable, proved they were enough. Sometimes the ritual expanded to the whole house. A parent cracked the window, less reflection, and shouted up the stairwell for a teenager to try the set in the bedroom. A sibling, drafted and barefoot, trotted to the kitchen to kill the fluorescent light that sometimes hummed in the picture like a ghost. The room listened for changes the way a choir listens for pitch. Everyone quiet at once, then a collective nod when it sounded right. You could tell when it was right because you stopped noticing it. There was the rooftop ballet too for the families who braved it. A ladder creaked, and a father or uncle climbed into the dusk, holding a wrench between teeth, hands blackened by the day's honest work and now turning bolts that pointed the big antenna toward a station's faraway tower. Down below, a mother leaned out the window, hair pinned back, calling, "Commands with the precision of a lighthouse keeper. That's better. No, back, too far, okay. Right there." Children ran between window and sofa, breathless translators converting a parent's "better" into the exact right word to yell toward the roof. Perfect! When the picture snapped into surprising clarity, everyone felt taller. The human antenna position had variations codified the way families codify recipes. Some swore by the one-hand hover, steadying just above the tips without touching. Others preferred the shoulder brace with the knuckle lightly anchored to the cabinet's wood. The bold tried the two-hand crown, cupping the ears like antlers and grinning while the room dissolved into laughter. There was the part nobody liked. "Don't move," said to the person whose mere presence perfected the signal. They became a statue for the length of a scene, noble and slightly small, bargaining for a bigger slice of pie later. Deals were struck, pies were earned, and then, right when satisfaction was certain, the commercial break threw a curveball. The volume leapt, the picture softened, the fine-tuned ring demanded attention again, coy as a cat. Someone would slide forward and perform the tiniest correction, a quarter-inch of grace, and the world returned to proper focus. Commercials had their own rituals, a chorus of hums when a familiar jingle arrived, a mass exhale when the show returned, and the room settled back into its shared heartbeat. Even the furniture participated. The sofa cushion closest to the set belonged to the evening's adjuster, the night of the rabbit ears, until bedtime. The coffee table kept a tiny screwdriver in the drawer, just in case, plus a waxy pencil for marking the lucky angles on a slip of paper that nobody ever read later but never threw away. On top of the set, a lace doily or crocheted runner made every adjustment feel ceremonial, like changing the vestments on a small altar. The dust had a way of arranging itself along the vents in patient stripes. Every so often someone blew across them, and the picture sharpened a fraction, as if the set appreciated the spa treatment, and always the phrases, family magic words, incantations that sounded like stage directions. Back a hair, split the difference, don't goose it, lock it in. Nobody planned these, they formed naturally around the nightly challenge, and years later you could say split the difference while parking a car or slicing a cake and everyone would understand. There were small private victories. A child entrusted for the first time with the fine-tuned ring turned it so gently that the host's cufflinks snapped into focus like tiny moons. A grandparent, usually content to sit quiet, leaned forward and tapped the side of the cabinet once, twice with an experienced knuckle, and the rolling picture straightened as if scolded by an old teacher. A teenager discovered that if they sat in the armchair at a diagonal, their particular shape in space made Channel 7 perfect. They pretended not to care while taking that seat every night thereafter. When colour crept into more living rooms, the ritual simply learned new steps. Alongside the old guardians came tint and colour knobs, subtle rulers of flesh tone and meadow green. Too much and faces leaned orange. Too little and the world drifted back towards silver. Families argued cheerfully about what real looked like. Someone would adjust during a commercial featuring a baseball field. Grass was the standard by which all other greens were judged, and declare victory when the infield dirt looked like summer. In the background of all this was the unspoken lesson. Perfection was a conversation, not a possession. The picture didn't have to be flawless to be beloved. It had to be tidied. People took turns tending. Children learned patience by holding a pose while their arm tingled, learned humility when a grandparent's 2-knock fix worked better than high-tech plans, learned attention from the way a quarter turn could change a face, a sentence, a feeling. Parents learned to accept good enough at exactly the right moment, when the room's collective shoulders dropped an inch and the story took over. And if the night ended with a little snow still dusting the corners of the image, nobody minded. The imperfection felt like weather at the edge of a warm window. The set clicked off, the picture folded into that fading star, and the rabbit ears stood quiet again, elegant and uncomplaining, crossed just so, as if holding the rest of the evening safely between them. In the morning, sun would catch on the aluminum flags, making thin sparks on the wall. They would wait all day for the ritual to resume, knowing that somewhere between science and superstition, fussing and faith, a family would gather and make a picture together. At first, everything arrived in shades of moonlight, so many kinds of grey that your eyes learned to tell stories with them. You could feel the warmth up in a mother's smile even when it was the colour of rain. You could hear the shine of a chrome bumper though it matched the sofa's shadow. Black and white was honest like that, all structure and light, a winter drawing that knew how to whisper. People tuned their sets and their imaginations together, and the living room made up the rest. Then slowly, like spring sneaking into February, colour began to make promises at the edge of the picture. The rumour always reached the neighbourhood first. Someone down the block had seen a colour set in the appliance store window. Roses the red of a secret, a sky that looked freshly washed. People described it with hands as much as words, painting the air between them. It wasn't just red, they'd say. It was ripe. Children pressed their faces to the shop glass on Saturdays and stared at a flock of televisions all set to the same programme, peacocks fanning their tails in a ceremony that felt like a door opening. You could hear the chorus of salesmen, cheerful and slightly reverent, explaining tint and hue as if introducing a new friend to the family. Saving for a colour set was a season of its own. Coins disappeared into a jar with a heavy sound, a quiet vote for future brightness. Catalogue pages grew soft at the corners where fingers had traced the handsome cabinets, walnut, maple, blonde, televisions that were also furniture, a piece of the house with their own gravity. Parents compared models as if choosing a piano. Which one looked right under the picture window? Which one would make the room feel like it had finally learned its true name? When the decision came, it arrived with a phone call and a delivery date circled on the calendar like a holiday. The day the colour set came home, the living room made space the way a heart makes space for a new member. The old black and white, faithful, sturdy was dusted, thanked out loud by at least one person who could not help it, then pushed gently to a new corner, or promised to a cousin. Two men in canvas jackets carried the new one in, with careful hands and a short ceremonial grunt. They set it down with the respect usually reserved for a sofa or a piano, plugged it in and turned it on just to prove that this was really happening. The screen woke with that familiar pearl grey bloom, then reached beyond it, a faint blush at first, as if embarrassed by its own beauty. Colour wasn't a switch, it was a conversation, between the set and the signal, between the knobs and your eyes, between expectation and what the world actually looked like. The new guardians, tint, colour, brightness, contrast, waited beneath the screen like instruments in an orchestra pit. You tuned flesh first, always flesh. If the host's cheek slid toward pumpkin or chalk, you backed the tint the other way, chasing a memory of a real face you had once seen in daylight. Then you tested grass, the universal calibration, ballparks on Saturday, parades on holidays, every green a judgment. Too blue and the field looked tired, too yellow and it looked feverish. You nudged until the outfield felt like a June afternoon you could step into. Neighbours came to help, or to witness, or simply to stand with their arms folded and grin like people on a dock waiting for a ship to pass. Someone brought pie, someone brought opinions. A child assigned to the fine-tune ring turned it by breaths, while the adults debated whether the sky ought to be this blue in October. "Leave it," a grandmother said finally, the authority of a person who had known 1,000 skies. The room obeyed, and for a long minute nobody spoke because the host's tie was precisely the right shade of green, and that seemed like a miracle worth not interrupting. The first colour programme you watched at home took its time arriving. Maybe it was a Sunday evening, the living room drowsy with roast and dishwater steam, when the programme's opening burst into coloured geometry so bright it felt like confetti thrown at your eyes. Or it was a western where the land itself seemed to exhale, saddle leather deep as coffee, mesas that wore the day like a robe. You learned that shadows carried colour too, that a red dress held quieter reds in its folds, that nighttime could be blue without being cold. Black and white had taught you structure. Colour taught you flavour. Commercials, always a step ahead, showed off as if they'd been practicing for this moment in secret. Fruit gleamed with the polish of a fairy tale. Soap bubbles took on the faint pink of the bathroom tile. A new car posed beneath studio lights, paint so saturated it felt like it would leave a mark if you touched it. Children leaned forward, eyes wide, bodies remembering to breathe only when the scene cut away. Parents leaned back, half smiling, measuring the new world against the old in the quiet tally only grown-ups keep. Colour asked you to make peace with close enough. On some nights, a face would drift too warm as the show cut from studio to location. You'd reach for the tint and then think better of it, letting the room learn to accept that people look different in late afternoon than they do at noon. On stormy days, the picture's edges wavered and the greens deepened like a lawn drinking rain. You stopped chasing perfection and started watching again. The lesson settled in without needing to be named. Calibration is love, but so is letting go. The old shows came through in silver still, and their beauty sharpened against the new palette rather than fading. You'd slip into a courtroom drama and notice how the grayscale made her faces honest. Then a colour program would follow, and a lamp would suddenly have a personality, its shade the exact cream of morning coffee. The living room learned 2 dialects and became fluent in both, switching from one to the other without thinking. It was like living in a house where everyone could sing and hum. Holidays became pageants. The parade's floats were frosted in hues so cheerful you half expected to taste sugar. Marching band uniforms popped like little flags. Families gathered early, bowls clinking, to watch the first daffodil yellow banner turn a corner, and someone always said, "Would you look at that," with the tone reserved for newborns and sunsets. Fireworks on television carried less thunder than the real thing, but the colours extended their hands through the screen anyway, and the living room took them. Sports changed too. A baseball game at dusk looked like summer distilled, grass cool and welcoming, clay infield the warm rust of a well-loved glove, white uniforms catching the last light and sending it back. Football fields became maps, all measured hope and chalk. Even a golf tournament whispered in new languages, fairway green like patience, putting green like nerves. People who had never cared much about uniforms found themselves arguing gently about whether the blue one was truer this season than last. Colour travelled into space and underneath the sea. Coral reefs glowed like stained glass. Deep water turned a blue that felt like a secret you could keep. When the camera returned to a host in a studio, his tie felt like a joke shared with the ocean you had just met. Children looked from screen to aquarium bowl and back again, certain that both were somehow cousins. Over time, the house built a private index of colour memories. The first yellow umbrella you saw on a rainy sitcom, the exact pink of a birthday cake on a variety show, the green of a cartoon dragon that everyone agreed was perfect and refused to let anyone adjust ever again. Of course there were nights when colour misbehaved. Faces went a shade nobody owns. A dress flickered between cherry and cranberry, like it couldn't make up its mind. Someone would lean forward, pinch the tint knob delicately, and perform the smallest rescue possible. The room would exhale. "That's it," someone said, and the show continued. On other nights, mischievous harmony reigned. The picture leaned too warm, but the living room did too. Blankets, cocoa, a cat asleep near the heat vent, so nobody touched a thing. In quiet moments, the set at rest looked like a piece of furniture that happened to know a lot about daylight. You dusted it with the same care you gave the piano, polish catching along the wood grain, the faint smell of orange and beeswax rising as if to say good evening. On top, small trophies of family life collected, a school photo in a frame the colour of butterscotch, a clay ashtray shaped like a flower and glazed in a green, so sincere it felt like a promise, a knick-knack from a fair, the kind of small bright thing that knows it lives in a house where colour is noticed. And somewhere inside the cabinet, behind the humming, behind the tiny cathedral of glass and wires, a dot of science made a picture in 3 pieces, red, green, blue, braiding them into the world you knew and the world you wanted at the same time. You didn't need to name any of that. You only needed to sit there with people you loved, while a dress turned red in your eyes and a sky became sky again, and a bowl of cherries on a kitchen counter in a sitcom made you think about the cherries you might buy next week. Black and white had been faithful. Colour was generous. The living room kept them both, the way a family keeps old stories and new ones together on the same shelf, each making the other easier to love. It began in the late afternoon, long before the set actually warmed. The clock itself seemed to lean toward the evening's promise. The schedule lived in the house like an extra piece of furniture, folded into a magazine, tacked to the side of the fridge, penciled into the margin of a calendar with birthdays and dentist appointments. Someone had circled tonight's show days ago. Dinner worked backward from that circle. Potatoes on at this time, table cleared by that time, dishes stacked, sink rinsed, tea poured, everyone migrating to the living room as if the hands on the clock were tugging softly at their sleeves. You didn't stumble into a program, you prepared for it. Homework done early, pyjamas staged like a quiet bribe, the dog taken out before the opening theme so no one had to miss a line. The phone, if it rang, was answered with a voice that already apologised. Call you back right after, and then set gently back on the cradle. Neighbours learned one another's rhythms. The block got quiet at 5 past the hour. Porch lights flicked on, a few silhouettes crossed windows, and then the street surrendered to the glow of living rooms. It felt like a town bell you couldn't hear, only see in the synchronised settling of houses. The guide, thin paper, ink that left a faint smudge on your fingers, was studied like a map. Columns of tiny type made the evening feel official. Adults debated the cruel generosity of choice, 2 favourites opposite each other, a special programme preempting the regular one. Children argued for their pick with the intricate logic of lawyers. The final decision, once reached, never felt arbitrary. It settled like weather. And when the time came, it was a small triumph to be seated and ready not a minute late, as if you and the show had agreed to meet at a park bench and you were the kind of family that kept promises. The opening notes of a theme song worked like a church bell. People who dawdled in the hallway appeared in the doorway as if summoned by a spell, one foot already searching for its slipper. A father straightened his belt. A mother tucked a blanket over a child's toes. Someone on the floor slid fractionally closer to the coffee table, pencil ready to draw idly during the slower scenes. The room formed a shape around the set that was the same every week, like the outline of a favourite chair that has learned your body. Because you were choosing one moment over all other possible moments, attention became almost tender. The jokes landed bigger. The quiet scenes felt braver. A glance between characters could open a small door in your own chest, because you had saved a place for it all week. When a neighbour knocked unexpectedly, the entire room negotiated the interruption with polite efficiency. The door opened fast, a finger went to lips, greetings were whispered, and either they were folded into the ritual or gently sent away with a promise to talk later. It wasn't snobbery, it was stewardship. Time was scarce, meaning was costly. The show had been invited. Commercials were not intrusion so much as breathers that shaped the hour. Families learned the cadence. 2 scenes, a break. 3 scenes, a break. The last act with a softer landing. Bathroom trips were a sprint with choreography. Someone disappeared and returned at the length of a jingle. Tea was topped off with a speed that never sloshed. The word hurry needn't be spoken. The music itself kept time. There was even a small competitive art to ending a chore in the second, just before the show resumed. Switching off the kitchen light and gliding back to the sofa as the first note returned, victorious and a little smug. Cliffhangers gave the week a backbone. A door opened, but we didn't see who stood there. 2 people reached for each other and the picture went to black. A voice said next time as if it were an oath. The house carried those unfinished sentences from Tuesday to Tuesday, adults pretending not to care, children plotting elaborate outcomes. At school the next morning, the yard answered with its own chatter. What do you think? Did you see? Kids who missed it stood at the edge of the circle and listened, learning once again the cost of lateness in a world that would not rewind for you. Sympathy was real, but so was the rule. If you wanted to belong to the conversation, you arrived on time. Some nights felt elastic, sports that ran long, a speech that nudged the rest of the schedule downstream. The room adapted in little ripples. Someone fetched a sweater. Someone told a joke. The dog turned one full circle before resettling. If the preemption cut your show entirely, you learnt the sportscaster's polite apology and saved your disappointment the way you might save a coin, a tiny lesson in patience added to the jar. Summer offered compensation, reruns that were like postcards from a trip you'd already taken. You noticed a detail missed the first time, a line that landed differently now, and the house hummed with the comfort of recognition. The surprise was gone, the pleasure remained. Sundays made their own music. Families returning from late afternoon visits or church slid right into the evening's gentle pageant, the show that came like a porch light before bedtime. The theme song felt like a hand on the shoulder. Here we are again, safe for the week getting itself ready. On those nights, exceptions to bedtime were negotiated with solemn ceremony. You may stay up for this one, a parent might say, and the child absorbed the privilege as if it were a medal. They paid for it the next morning with heavier eyes and wore the heaviness with pride. The house synchronized itself to the notion of lead-ins and finales. The show before your show became familiar by proximity. You learned its theme song without meaning to. When a special aired, an awards ceremony, a moon landing, a live musical, the living room swelled to fit more people. Neighbours brought folding chairs and an extra plate of cookies. The feeling that swept through the room didn't come from novelty alone. It came from simultaneity. You were one living room among millions, all attending to the same minute hand, the same breath, the same cut to a wide shot. It didn't make your room smaller, it made it more itself. There were rules about interruptions that lived in jokes because it was kinder that way. Vacuuming happened at 20 past the hour, never at the top. The loud drawer in the sideboard was avoided until a commercial. The squeaky floorboard got a softer step. Windows were cracked to keep the room from growing drowsy. Curtains were drawn to keep reflections off the screen. The etiquette evolved like any household ritual. One part necessity, one part superstition, all parts love. Because shows didn't wait. People became timekeepers. The mantel clock's minute hand was trusted. The kitchen clock ran 2 minutes fast on purpose. Watches were tapped against wrists as if that could hasten the world. Daylight saving time passed through the house like a clever trickster. Someone always worried for a full day that they'd missed something by an hour. They hadn't, but the worry proved how much these appointments mattered. The appointments were not just with programs, they were with one another. If you said you'd be there, you showed up with your blanket and your particular laugh and the way you always gasped a half second before everyone else. The scarcity sharpened memory. You could summon not just lines of dialogue, but the way a certain Thursday smelled. Meatloaf, crayons, a wet dog laundry steam, and the feel of the carpet on your elbows. When a character's catchphrase arrived, the room spoke with them, not mocking, but greeting. You learned that anticipation was its own flavour. The 5 minutes before the show were rich with expectation, and halfway through the week you could already taste them again. Occasionally life outran the schedule. Company stayed late, a car wouldn't start, a baby refused sleep. On those nights you missed it. The room did not punish you. It simply contained your small regret alongside the reason for it. Someone caught you up in 3 sentences after, and the gap in your knowing became a neat seam you could feel if you traced it. In summer, if the rerun gods were kind, you found that night again and sealed the seam with a satisfied nod. If not, the seam remained. a reminder that even beloved rituals share the house with surprise. As the hour drew to its end, a curious quiet came over the room, the same hush that settles on a theatre during the last scene. People leaned forward as if to hold the moment in their hands. The credits rolled with the light still low. A parent reached for the switch but waited for the final note, and then the room released its breath. Chatter returned like birds after a rain. Dishes to rinse, lunch boxes to pack, school shoes to find, one last joke to send everyone up the stairs smiling. The appointment had been kept, the week could continue, and then, inevitably, another circle on the calendar waited. The house carried the appointment like a little pilot light that never went out. Schedules shifted, children grew, shows ended, and new ones found their way into the slot, but the core remained. A time and a place, and a promise to meet. In a world that insisted on moving, this was the still point you could set your furniture around. A shared hour that arrived exactly when it said it would, and, because you arrived too, became larger than itself. It felt like a living room carnival that came to your door right on time, no ticket needed, no coat required. The host stepped through the screen as if he had borrowed your front stoop. He knew how to wink without closing an eye, to clap without drowning out the band, to turn a joke into a welcome mat. He introduced a comedian with a face rubbery as bread dough and timing sharp enough to slice it, a singer who could hold a note until the dog in the next house sighed, a dance troupe that stitched tap 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 across your rug until your own toes kept counting after they'd finished. The house learned a new kind of silence, the good kind, the breath-held kind right before a punchline, and then the laughter arrived in waves. First the studio audience, then your room, then the echo of your own laugh when you heard someone else's. Variety meant the hour unfolded like a box of chocolates without labels. Everyone picked favourites and then changed their minds the moment the next act started. Skits played with the week's news without drawing blood, and the props, hats, fake moustaches, doorbells that always rang at the wrong moment, lived in the imagination afterward like visiting relatives you secretly hoped would move in. The band stayed busy in the corner, brass rising like a good mood, a drummer placing tiny commas where applause might go. Even the cue cards felt friendly, that big block handwriting that told the host what you were already thinking. You could watch a juggler rescue 3 wobbling plates and feel your own Friday steady. You could watch a crooner lean into a standard and hear your parents, younger, swaying somewhere nobody else could see. Holiday specials turned the set into a tinsel stage. Snowflakes as big as cookies, choirs in sweaters the colour of wrapped gifts, a comedian in a Santa beard that never fooled anybody. Telethons stretched past bedtime and made generosity feel like a talent you could practice. The host's tie loosened as the numbers climbed, and you learned the look of tired people who keep going because it matters. Local acts slipped in too. The ventriloquist from the hardware store parade, the kid who could play polka on a tiny accordion, the baton twirler who had the whole town's last name. The applause they got felt different in your chest. Softer and somehow larger, hand laughter was there if you listened for it, but your own laughter always took the lead, crooked, real, flavoured by the room. Between acts, the camera wandered across the audience, catching couples in their Sunday best on a Tuesday, older men applauding with their hats tucked politely on their knees, teenagers clapping a fraction too cool, and then forgetting to be cool the moment the tap shoes started again. It taught you that attention can be generous, that you don't have to love everything to love the evening, that an hour of small surprises can leave you taller. When a guest star reappeared months later, the room greeted them like a cousin, already in on the joke. And when the closing number gathered everyone, comics in their grease paint, dancers with their hairpins, the bandleader grinning like a proud uncle, you felt folded into a bow the show tied around itself and handed to you to keep until next week. And then came the songs that climbed into your pockets and stayed. Commercials didn't only sell, they rehearsed with you. A whistle hook threaded through the kitchen as plates were dried. A 5-note promise about soap turned into the beat for marching down the hall to brush your teeth. Cereal boxes were scored like sheet music, snap and crunch conducted by a cheerful chorus. And toothpaste sang the bright white gospel in voices stacked like a layer cake. You learned whole choruses without meaning to, rhyme schemes that made shopping lists scan. Brass section punched out the happiness of dish soap. A vibraphone winked at you from a soda ad that bubbled right out of the screen. Barbershop quartets guaranteed that razors could make mornings behave. Mascots trained your memory like friendly drill sergeants. A tiger with gym class pep, a genial cartoon sailor, a slick-haired announcer who hit every consonant like a cymbal. Families made games of it, name that jingle, finish that line, declaring points no one kept and winners everyone recognised. Kids rewrote the lyrics into ridiculous versions at the bus stop. Parents pretended to disapprove and then added harmonies. Local spots gave the night a neighbourhood accent. The furniture showroom where the owner waved shyly beside a lopsided Christmas tree. The tyre shop with the owner's toddler clapping on the beat 2 seconds late. The diner that promised pie so convincingly you could taste cinnamon through the glass. Some jingles timed your life, 1 bathroom trip long, exactly the duration of a kettle's whisper, just enough to scoop ice into glasses before the story returned. Others taught a kind of advertising arithmetic. 2 verses equals a refill, bridge means grab the blanket, modulated key change means sit down, it's almost back. Adults pretended immunity and then whistled those tunes while balancing the checkbook. Children fell asleep humming to a toothpaste slogan as if it were a lullaby. There were seasons in the melodies too. Lemonade arriving in the brass of June. Back-to-school corduroys swishing in September woodwinds. Cocoa crooning in December with sleigh bell patience. Now and then an ad stunned the room, the first flash of a car's paint that seemed invented that morning. A slow-motion orange being sliced so vividly you could hear the spray. Colour made the jingles feel like postcards from a brighter country. Black and white made them elegant, like little tuxedoed songs. You learned that repetition plus melody equals permanence. Years later, a cashier's tone could knock open a trapdoor in your mind and an entire chorus would climb out, hats on, smiling, ready to dance across your memory. The commercials also gave the evening its breath marks. They let grandparents adjust a cushion with the sigh that says, "I'm fine." They let someone sneak a cookie, someone else tuck a blanket corner, cat re-knead the same 3 inches of lap. And when a beloved jingle ended on that familiar button, badam, the room clicked back to attention together, the way an orchestra finds the downbeat without looking. The show mattered, yes, but these small songs stitched the hour, hemming the story with tiny, shiny threads you could still see the next morning, catching the light as you passed the set on your way to school. The room changed it to posture when the news came on, the way a face softens when it's about to listen. The opening notes were not a theme so much as a clear the throat for the country. They stacked the evening into chapters, top stories, the world, the nation, the city, the weather, the close. A parent reached for the volume with 2 fingers, careful, and set it at a level that made space for murmurs and questions. The anchor's desk filled the screen like a kitchen table for millions. Papers squared, tie knotted with that particular seriousness that said, "We will look at this together." Even the dog understood the change and settled with a sigh that sounded respectful. Faces from far away arrived and found seats in your living room. Marchers and mourners, students waving signs, a man speaking into a wind that wanted to steal his words, a woman laughing in a crowd that was halfway between a parade and an argument. Sometimes the news felt like weather. You learned to read its isobars, sensed when a high pressure of hope was moving in, when a low of worry would sit over the map for days. Adults traded glances across the coffee table that were whole sentences. Children tried out new words, rolling them in their mouths like marbles: armistice, orbit, veto. learning which ones to say out loud and which ones to tuck into the quiet for later. The camera cut from the anchor to grainy streets, to a battlefield haze, to a Capitol hallway where important footsteps seemed to echo right into your rug. On hard nights the room leaned closer, not toward the set exactly, but toward one another, as if bodies could form a slight windbreak against whatever was arriving. Opinions surfaced, then smoothed, then surfaced again. A grandmother corrected a date gently, a teenager disagreed and then listened, surprised by the sense in what they'd just heard. When the news reached the part where numbers stacked up, votes counted, dollars pledged, casualties named, the anchor paused in a way that taught you to hold your breath and your temper at the same time. There were smaller local chapters that rooted the big stories in your own dirt. A fire 2 neighbourhoods over, a school board's decision that made your math book suddenly feel heavier or lighter, a missing dog you might improbably see tomorrow. You learned the weather person's smile, the way they could point at an invisible cold front and make you believe in arrows. Their map was a patchwork you could almost touch, counties quilted together with little temperatures like buttons. The forecast had a particular magic in winter. Snow, possible by morning, felt like a letter from the sky promising mischief. When the camera returned to the desk for the sign-off, the anchor usually gave you one small human thing to put in your pocket, a story about a rescued cat, a kid who built something clever, a handshake between 2 stubborn men. Then came the closing cadence. A farewell that wasn't flowery or long, just the daily promise that tomorrow would come, and with it, more attempts at understanding. The set clicked a little as it cooled between segments. The room exhaled. You did not always agree with the news or with each other, but you had felt it together, which is its own kind of truth. On the biggest nights, an election, a launch that turned a white dot into a human intention, a funeral that made even the commercials quiet, the sense of simultaneity pulsed like a second heartbeat. The country was too large to fit in a living room, but the living room tried anyway, and the attempt itself kept a certain kind of faith. On other evenings, the ritual leaned toward the ordinary miracle of dinner where you sat. The oven door opened with a warm, flowery sigh, and the foil-topped trays slid out like little stage sets with their own proscenium. The labels promised a complete meal in tidy compartments, mashed potatoes combed with a fork's neat lines, a stubborn hill of peas that refused to climb into the potatoes, a pat of meatloaf or turkey with gravy pooling like a small lake you were allowed to cross. Sometimes there was a tiny brownie in its own square, as dark and mysterious as a secret kept just long enough. The foil peeled back with a delicate crunch, releasing steam that carried the friendly smell of salt and sundae. Hands ferried the trays to the coffee table, and the table, usually home to magazines and coasters, became a dining room in miniature. TV trays unfolded with a confidence you could hear, metal legs catching, wooden tops making a sound like a book being opened. A parent balanced a plate, a napkin, and a glass with condensed water sweating a little ring onto a cork coaster that had already forgiven you in advance. The choreography belonged to everyone. A child slid a tray 2 inches to the left to make room for elbows. An older sibling traded peas for corn with the diplomacy of a world summit. Someone passed the ketchup like a torch. The show's rhythm timed the meal. First bite on the first laugh, sips during transitions, an unspoken intermission during the commercial, when forks paused and voices rose. Eating there made the screen feel generous instead of bossy. It wasn't stealing you from the table, it was setting another one. Knives sounded gentle against the aluminum, a pleasant, tinny score. You learned the ergonomic skill of cutting while keeping eyes on the picture, the art of not tipping the gravy lake toward the carpet, the noble patience of waiting for the brownie to cool enough to reclaim its shape from the pan. Sometimes a parent shook salt over your tray with the solemnity of a blessing. Sometimes a grandparent told you about the first time they saw a frozen dinner, how futuristic it seemed, how it freed an hour you could spend laughing instead of washing. The conversation curled around the show like steam. Small comments, quick theories, a chorus of shh during a favourite line that somehow made the laughter bigger when it came. There were fancier versions too. Plated dinners carried on wobbly laps, pot pies that cracked their golden tops with a spoon, tomato soup cupped between two hands while the news measured the world in inches of rain and inches of patience, pizza cut into family-sized geometry, slices traded for crusts, someone always choosing the piece with the most pepperoni because that felt like a night one. Sandwiches wrapped in wax paper made their own ceremony, the little curl at the end undone with a flourish, just as the theme song began. The coffee table collected these moments like stickers on a suitcase. Rings, crumbs, a tiny scar from a fork mishap that turned into a family legend. Even spills became part of the liturgy. A quick stand, a chorus of napkins, the relief of a stain that never quite appeared, the shared joke about next time you use the tray, kiddo, that somehow meant you're forgiven before you ask. On special evenings, the living room added extras. A glass bottle of soda that hissed with manners as you lifted the cap. Popcorn popping loudly into the kitchen like applause arriving early. A bowl of coleslaw that threatened to slosh during the punchlines. There were guest plates when neighbours dropped by. And the coffee table stretched itself with goodwill to fit one more setting. When the show reached a quiet scene, forks softened their clink as if they too were listening. When the music swelled, the room took bigger bites and smiled with a mouthful permission rarely granted at the regular table. If a tray skidded, a palm steadied it without anyone looking away from the screen. The casual rescue of people practiced in small kind saves. When the last bites disappeared and the credits rolled, the room reversed the ritual in a series of easy gestures. Foil folded over the remaining peas, trays stacked like polished shields, glasses gathered by the tallest to avoid a second trip. A parent wiped the coffee table in slow circles that erased the evening's evidence but not its warmth. Dishes clinked in the sink like wind chimes in another room. Someone made a small happy sound that meant that hit the spot, and the show left behind a glow that was not just about story or salt. It was about the pleasure of being fed and entertained in the same breath, side by side, shoulder to shoulder, without ceremony and yet entirely ceremonial. Later, walking through the dim room, you could point to where you sat by heart and picture the tray in your lap, the fork in your hand, the laugh you shared mid-chew. You could still hear the foil's soft applause and feel the living room being, for one easy hour, both kitchen and theatre, both hearth and stage. Saturday arrived with a different kind of light, the sort that sneaks around curtains and taps the tip of your nose, then slips away before grown-ups notice. You woke to a house unusually kind to early footsteps. The floor felt cooler, the hallway longer, the slippers farther than you remembered, but the promise humming from the living room shortened every distance. The set's power knob offered its tiny resistance, then yielded. The grey pearl opened. The sound woke soft, and suddenly it was morning, not just in your house, but in a paper and ink world where animals talked and anvils fell with impeccable comic timing. You didn't need a clock. The lineup itself kept time nested like dolls. Funny short, adventure short, serial ad, toy ad, theme song you knew better than your own address. Serial became ceremony. Boxes turned into architecture. Forts, skylines, launch pads for spoon rockets. Milk poured like weather. Prize coupons hid in flaps like buried treasure. You negotiated alliances with siblings to share, trade, betray, forgive, and share again. The spoon scraped the bowl in circles that matched the chase on the screen. You learned the physics of SOG, how long a puff maintained structural integrity, how to submerge and rescue, how to time the crunch with the punchline. Parents negotiated a truce with the hour. A little more sleep for them, a little more sugar for you, and silence soft enough to be called respect. The living room, which wore seriousness at night, put on a robe and laughed at itself. You had favourite voices, the ones you could draw with your eyes closed. A laugh that sounded like a trombone with a cold. A growl that lived in the hinge of a door. A whistle that could lift you an inch off the rug. You learned cartoon physics before school physics, that falling takes a full beat to begin, that cliffs are suggestions, that friendship is measured in how often you chase someone without catching them. The commercials between were an extension of the world, populated by marshmallows shaped like beliefs, action figures whose elbows understood destiny, plastic tracks that promised velocity in any house with a hallway. You memorised jingles like multiplication tables and were surprised later to find which set stuck better. There were rules, benevolent, fluent, and precise. Sit far enough away to keep your eyes friendly. Don't block the screen with a fort taller than your knees. Turn it down if the baby stirs. The dog may not learn the theme song, but will absolutely learn the part where the doorbell rings. The show that made your parent laugh counted twice. The one that made them shake their head and smile was yours alone, and somehow more precious. Sometimes a grandparent wandered in with a mug and stayed past the first cartoon, chuckling low at jokes that felt like they belonged to adults and yet somehow loved you best. As the morning grew its bones, the lineup shifted. Cartoons yielded to live hosts who talked to puppets with the gravity of diplomats. Science segments that made eggs hover and pennies brighten arrived like secret homework you actually wanted. A host might tell you to go outside when the show ended, and you did, carrying the morning's physics into the yard where you were. For exactly 1 hour after, a coyote, a witch, a detective, a knight, a hero whose cape was a towel and whose wrath was limited by lunchtime. By noon, the house had shrugged on its Saturday chores. Lawnmower aria, vacuum rondo, laundry percussion, and the television receded into background hum or baseball, a bridge between morning inventions and afternoon errands. And then there was the opposite bookend, night sign-off, formal and intimate. The last show bowed, the theme song slowing like a carousel, and the screen shifted to something ceremonial. Maybe the flag filled the frame, rippling as if it had its own breath. Maybe an image of a lighthouse turned through fog. Maybe a montage of mountains and wheat fields and skylines. Maybe just the station's call letters in a font that wore a tie. The national anthem rose, brass bright, percussion careful, and even if no one stood, the room did a little. A parent turned the volume up 2 clicks, not out of rules, but out of a habit that felt close to gratitude. After that, a voice, polite, tired, neighbourly, told you the station was signing off, wished you a good night, and promised they'd be back at dawn with farm reports and the day's first friendliness. The picture shifted to a test pattern, geometry crowned with feathers, circles within circles, grey bars that looked like a city built by rulers. If you stayed up long enough, you learned the vocabulary of after, tone that held the room like a single long breath, colour bars bright as candy in the new decade. Then snow, the kind that falls without cold. The set's glass didn't just go dark, it listened to you thinking. You could see your own reflection sitting where the anchor had sat, small and still, person in a room that had just watched the world and decided to sleep. Some nights were not ordinary, even if you tried to make them so. Calls were made during dinner, "Are you watching?" and the soft agreements braided across town like copper wire. The living room filled early. Folding chairs were fetched from the basement and opened with a polite snap. Grandparents took the spots nearest the end table. Kids gravitated to the floor, elbows propped, faces captured by a confidence so bright it could ignite a page. The table gathered quiet snacks, a plate of cookies that seemed beside the point, a pitcher of something cold that no one remembered to pour once the countdown began. Numbers appeared, and their authority was absolute. 10, 9, 8, your breath obeyed. The room learned to hold still, a white body against a blue sky, the Earth's oldest contrast made new by fire. Flame flowered and did not consume, it lifted. Sound lagged behind sight in a way that measured distance with wonder. Cheeks held salt for reasons no one explained aloud. The camera lost the rocket for a second and found it again. An adult said there to reassure themselves as much as the children. On those nights your living room was a pew, a balcony, a hillside, a public square large enough for the country and small enough for your dog to understand that something mattered. The anchors put words to awe, then ran out, then tried again. Diagrams marched across the screen. Arrows, orbits, a new geometry you carried like a pocket marble. When the camera turned inside the capsule, the world got quiet. Faces in helmets were both anonymous and intimate. You knew their names and also knew that names were inadequate in the presence of that kind of courage. A glove reaching for a switch was a cathedral. A sentence beginning with "We are go" made your living room larger than itself. You learned that silence on television could be the loudest thing, the seconds where no one dared speak lest they knock the moment off balance. On the biggest night, the picture refused to be smooth. It arrived as ghosts and grains and shadows that learned to be a man stepping where no man had. The room counted a footfall that did not count you, and yet included you. The room repeated a sentence you did not write and yet had been waiting to hear all your short life. Hands found hands without theatrics. Someone laughed through tears once, just once, and a child thought, mysteriously, that gravity was not only a pull but also a promise. Somewhere across town a cheer lifted. Somewhere else a car horn answered. Your house joined a choir you could not see. The dog tilted its head like an old philosopher. Later, when space became commute and splashdowns routine, you learned new rituals. Tracking stations listed like foreign cousins, heat shields praised like saints, a ship bobbing obediently while the sea congratulated itself. The camera found sailors clapping, engineers hugging with the clumsiness of people unpracticed in public joy. A reporter who had been careful all night finally removing his glasses and smiling into a future he did not attempt to predict. You went to bed, and the ceiling seemed higher. Sleep felt like falling through air that had been rearranged. Not every held breath belonged to rockets. There were other nights, a ball arcing through a stadium's October breath, a pen scratching its name across a piece of paper that made headlines into laws, a procession that taught the nation how to weep politely and together. The set learned the trembling limit of its power, to witness, not to change, and the room learned the limit of its own. And still you watched, because watching together is a kind of doing. Once the screen carried images that confused and frightened, and the room tried to make sense of them and failed. The adults' faces, usually in charge of calm, looked toward the anchor, as if he were a lighthouse, and then toward the children, as if they were. The world did not end. It continued, thinner for a while, then thicker, the way soup recovers after you add water and wait. After nights like those, the sound of the refrigerator became the most human thing, the machine breathing for the house while the house remembered how. Someone washed 2 cups slower than necessary. Someone else folded a blanket in quarters that did not need that much precision. You stood for a moment in the doorway and looked at the television, at the quiet square where the country had just fit, and you said goodnight to it under your breath, because there are objects that deserve thanks, and you were learning that. And now, as our screen goes dim and the room rediscovers its own light, take one more slow breath. The houses we visited, yours, mine, the ones that came before, still hold the outlines of elbows on carpets and hands over mouths and laughter that doubled as medicine. If this settle drift through the 60s warmed a corner of your night, let it ride with you into sleep. When you wake, you'll find that some things never left. The pleasure of showing up on time for each other, the way a shared story turns 4 walls into a small country, the knowledge that even a flicker can be a hearth. If you're still awake, thank you for being here with me. If you're already drifting, I'll keep my voice low and carry the credits out softly. Good night, friend. I'll meet you at the glow again next time.